Um, Let us do today, Shavua Tov, everyone. Today's Daf Kuf. These are, it's fun and also it's a little terrifying to do this in Daf Yomi because they're so dense and complicated dafim in terms of a halacha, and each line here ends up being a huge implication for things we do all the time. Today's Daf especially, but we've had a whole week of this, and we're going to have more really in the next parak when we get to Basar B'Chalav when we get there. So. Today, I'll start from the two dots at the bottom of daf. Well, why not? Two dots in the bottom. Last line, it's the same thing. Mishnah that we right. The Mishnah about Gida Nasha said that if you cook a Gida Nasha, which is usher to eat, with other pieces of meat, then if you remove it, then the question is, did it impart taste in what's left behind? And so we had a long discussion about notein tam and what the ratio is for tam and how you figure out tam. 160. That was last week's discussion. But then the Mishnah said that if you don't remove it, then you have, even if it doesn't give a taste, let's say you have, 50 pieces or 70 to 1, but it's sitting there, it's not batel. Says the Gemara at the bottom of Daf Tzaditin Mabet, Livatel Beruba. Why isn't it batel? Everything in the Torah is batel berov. Why shouldn't it be batel? Bir Yashani, the answer is that it's different. It's not batel because it's an entity. So when something is its own thing, a whole gid, it's not batel, even if you don't recognize which one is the gid. Continue the Mishnah then, now at the top line, two dots. Then the Mishnah said, V'chein chaticha shel nevela. Let's say you have a piece of nevela, and again, the assumption in this case, Rashi's assumption is, you have a piece of nevela, it drops in there, it's not giving taste for whatever reason. Let's say it's a minority, it doesn't have any taste, but it's present there. The Mishnah said it answers all the pieces. Asking more the same question, Tivatel beruba, why shouldn't it be batel berov, right? And in the case I like to use, you have a grill. You put down 5 steaks on your grill. Then you remember that one of them is a non-kosher steak. The other 4 are kosher. So there's no taste that's imparted, let's just say. I mean, it's not obviously not the case of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is talking about cooking them together, but it's the same idea. So then why don't you just rely on majority and say, eat the steak, right? Presumably the steak you're eating is a kosher steak. Says the Gemara, well, it depends, because remember that there's a whole discussion in Masechet Orla about when things are chashuv, are valuable and not batel. And there's a machloket about things that you count by unit, meaning if we sell things like flour, let's say, where you sell by weight, right, or measurement, it doesn't, obviously individual flour is batel, but things that you sell by unit, then we say are not batel. But there's a machloket in the Mishnah in Orla about whether that's true about things that are only sold by unit, which means et shedarko limanot, something that was always counted. So you would always go to the store and say, I want 6 of these, right? Or things that are kol shedarko limanot, meaning that it's sometimes sold by unit, right? So say, I don't know, it's hard to pick examples, but say strawberries, right? Which I don't know if that's a good example. We usually buy them by the pint, but I guess sometimes you would go and say, I want 6 strawberries. I'm not sure that's a great example, but yeah, because you would never say that. So Rashi says here, the example is exactly what I just gave, steaks, right? Where you can go to the store and say, I want 5 pounds of steaks, but you might go and say, I want 4 steaks because I have 4 guests coming over, right? So that's not a birya, but it is often counted by unit. So why? So hani chalamanda amar, the second line, kol shedarko limanot shaninu. If the Mishnah said anything that is ever counted by unit is not batel, that's why the steaks in this case are not batel, because sometimes you go and say, I have 4 guests, with Rashi's example, I want 4 steaks, right? El lamanda amar et shedarko limanot shaninu. According to the one who said that the Mishnah in Arla says only things that are always counted by unit are not batel. Meat is sometimes sold in, by pounds or by a larger amount. So ma'ikah lamemar answers the Gemara an answer that has tremendous implications for all halachot that we talk about. Shani chaticha ho v'ruya lechabed bo lifnei ha'orchim. That a piece of meat, or I'll call it a steak, is different because it's considered to be a unit that is kavod. It's kabed when you put it in front of someone. So as a unit, it's something respectable. You give someone a side of meat or whatever it is, that's chashuv, and therefore it's not batel. And so this ends up being the criteria. Well, let's read the Gemara and then we'll talk about it. V'tzricha. And you need to have both cases of the Mishnah, the gid and the piece of meat. Diyesh minan gid. If you had just told me the gid, I would say the reason the gid is not batel is mishum the biryahi, because it's a whole unit. It's the whole gid. Avol chaticha, but one rib steak, aim alone. Maybe that is batel. Diyesh minan chaticha. If you only said the case of a piece, I would have said, well, that's because these things are very valuable, meaning they're mechubad. But if you have a full gid, which is not anything that anyone wants to eat, that would be batel. And therefore, the Mishnah tells you that neither one is batel. And so that is the halacha. Tosfos here discusses a little bit that, in fact, again, taste is one issue, but if you even got around the taste question by having a large majority or whatever it might be, the fact is that if something is there and you didn't remove it because you can't recognize it, if it is either a birya, which means a thing that's whole and therefore of mechubad, therefore of some more value, or if it's a special thing that you would put in front of guests, it's not batel. The implication, though, Tosa says, is that if it's neither of those things, it would be batel. So the example that I think of, which again, don't take this home and do it, is I gave the example before of you have things on your grill, but let's say you put 5 hot dogs on your grill and you find out that one of the hot dogs is treif, it's from pork, right? So assuming that a hot dog is not a birya, because it's the farthest thing in the world from a birya, right? It's mashed up everything. And assuming it's kabed b'lefnei orchim, which is very debatable. What does that mean? But assuming it's not, according to this Gemara, and doesn't give taste, right? Because they're all on the grill. The majority are kosher, so you can take up and eat the hot dogs and assume it's kosher. Tosfos has asked a very interesting question. He says, can you eat all the hot dogs, right? Can you eat all 5? Because obviously you're for sure eating one that's not. And he says, well, maybe it's a better idea not to, right? Not to have one person eat all of them. But la halacha, this is very interesting. And again, there's a lot of definitions here, which I was vague about, and that's why halacha. What does litkaben bo mean? What's a birya, right? But that is the way our Gemara seems to conclude when you take aside the taste issue, right? Taste is a different issue when you put that aside. That's that Gemara. The next and final sugya before we get to the Mishnah is a very interesting case of Darish Rabba bar bar Chana, halfway down. Let's say you have, says Rabba bar bar Chana, you have a chaticha shel nevela or shel dag tameh. You have a piece of a non-kosher or not shechted animal, that's what a nevela is, or a piece of a non-kosher fish, right? A nice swordfish steak. And you drip them into your pot with kosher fish.
Well, swordfish may be kosher.
Okay, so a bad example, sorry. A shark, we'll say, okay. So let's say you mix those with your kosher fish and your dish and everything. Says Rabba bar bar Chana, halacha l'maisa, chaticha shel nevela v'shel dag tamei eino oseret ad shetitin tam, right? Obviously, again, the case is that the thing fell in and then you removed it, right? So again, our Mishnah said if you didn't remove it, it's a whole different question. But if you did remove it, then it's a question about did it impart taste, right? And we talked last week about what imparting taste is, batel b'shishim, unless it's something special, et cetera, et cetera. But says Rabba bar Chana, it's not the taste. Let's say you dropped, a piece of meat into your chullin with 20 other pieces of meat. It's not the taste of notin tam in the meat. It's notin tam in the entire pot. So it has to be titin tam birotav in rotav we translate usually as like gravy, ubekipa. I don't know how you translate kippah in English, but it usually refers to Rashi as the bits at the bottom, the small pieces that are there in the pot, ubechatichot, and the other pieces of meat or fish in that pot, right? So meaning it's the whole conglomerate. Let's say you have a stew with potatoes and carrots. It's batel if it's 1/60th, let's say, of that whole thing. So that was what Rabba bar bar Chana said, that if you drop the thing in there, don't just look at the other pieces of meat, right? Look at the whole stew, okay? So Rav heard about this, and Rav said, whoa, this is a big mistake. Uki Rav Amor Aleh. Remember that Rav didn't have the loudest voice, like most rabbis probably, but they used to have loudspeakers back in those days. They called them Amorah, which means the one who says over, right? And so Rav basically got the people who make the noise, and he told them to tell the following drasha to the people, and wherever Rabbi bar Chana was, the darash. And what he said was the following, that it's much more complicated than the Rabbi bar Chana made it seem. Because kivan shenatan tam bechaticha, chaticha atzma naseh nevela, ve'oseret koach. Well, let me read that line first. Says Rav once this, let's say again, you have piece A that's a nevela, and it falls into a pot. Now Rashi understands the cases. Rashi's not so clear, but Rashi's I'll oversimplify, is that basically the meat got mixed together first, and then the whole thing got dumped into the pot, or maybe you added the gravy and the water later, right? So the first what happened is piece A of trefa or nevela dropped into another piece that was kosher and touched it. And then later you added in, let's just say 60 times the first piece of heter, right? Of gravy and potatoes and all the other stuff. Says Rav, it doesn't matter that later on you added in 60 times because the second that that first piece of nevela touched and came into contact or absorbed with the piece of kosher, that kosher piece became a nevela itself, right? Kivan shenatan tam b'chaticha, since the non-kosher piece gave taste with the first chaticha of heter, chaticha atzman nase nevela. The chaticha itself becomes nevela. And so now you need to think about the kosher piece as being treifa also. So even though you removed the non-kosher piece, it doesn't matter, right? Because you still have some of the taste in the kosher piece. And further said Rav, ve'oseret kol hachatichot kulan. Now that one piece that touched the non-kosher piece will aser all of the meat in the pot, mipnei shehein mina, because it's min b'mina, right? And the rule is that no matter how much you have, it's machloket, but there's an opinion that one min with another min, if you mix one piece of meat with another piece of meat, it can never become batel. And so therefore, says Rav, it's not as simple as Rabbi Baruch Chana would have you assume, because you have to not just look at the end result, you have to look at the process in which the non-kosher meat touched the kosher meat. If it mixed together initially with one piece of kosher meat, that piece of kosher meat becomes a problem as well, even if you then remove the non-kosher piece from the whole stew. So that was what Rav said. Now said Rav Safra to Abaya, I'm going to 5 lines from the bottom. I'm going to Rav Safra le Abaya. No, Rav Safra said to Abaya, I don't understand Rav. Like, why did Rav need to tell me two things? Rav Kiman Amr L'Shmaitik Rabbi Yehuda. Clearly, Rav holds like Rabbi Yehuda, the Amram min b'mino mo batel. Right? Rabbi Yehuda holds that min b'mino is not batel. So I don't understand. Why did Rav have to then say two parts, that you put the treif meat touch the kosher meat, and therefore the kosher meat became the vela, and all the other pieces are puzzle because min b'mino eno batel. My area kinatan tam. Why do you have to have imparted taste into the kosher piece of meat? I feel kilonatan tam nami. Even if the treif piece fell in and was so minuscule, right? It was 1 ounce, let's say, and the kosher meat was 60 ounces, so it was not giving over a taste. It doesn't matter. It should still not become batel, right? I feel natan nami because min b'mino eno batel. Amar lei. So he said to him, well, and I gave away the answer already, but hacha b'mayaskin shekadam b'silko. Right? Rav was talking about a case where you basically took out the non-kosher piece. You took out the non-kosher piece, and therefore what's left in front of you in the pot. So again, the scenario here, according to Rashi, so you can imagine has a very different scenario, is that you have a nevela piece of meat. Okay, let's say that's all you have in the pot. You drop in a kosher piece of meat. Let's say the nevela is 2 ounces and the kosher meat is 4 ounces. So it's not batel, right? It's not 1 in 60, obviously. And they cook together for a little bit. And then you add in the whole stew, right? 60 times that, 100 ounces, 500 ounces, let's say 100 ounces of other material. And then, says Rav, you removed the non-kosher meat. So you took it out. So right now in your pot, you have the kosher meat and this 100 ounces of stew. And the question is it batel, right? I said 100, maybe it should be 200, right? So 2 to 100, right? 2 to 200. So according to Rav, it's not batel. And the reason it's not batel is because once the kosher piece touched the treif piece and got taste from it, the kosher piece itself becomes nivela. And although you then took out the non-kosher piece, and you would look at this whole thing and say, wait a second, 2 ounces, right, is batel in 200 ounces. So basically the whole thing should be batel. It's not batel because min b'mino ain't batel. Because since the piece that's left behind is nevela, even though the 2 ounces itself could not give taste, it doesn't matter. The whole thing is not batel. This is what Tosfos points out in the name for Rashi, if the original treifa couldn't give over, meaning let's say you had 1 ounce of treifa meat and 100 ounces of kosher meat, right? And you drop that in, there's no taste that would be imparted, right? Because that's batel. It's more than 60 to 1. But it's still min b'mina. And according to Rav Yehuda, all of the kosher meat would be usser because you have the non-kosher meat there, right? However, if you then remove the non-kosher meat, right, although the kosher meat would remain usser, the fact that no taste was imparted means that when you then put in all the gravy, you can't say the taste is going to the gravy, right? Because there's no taste to go. So you basically, according to Rashi's version here, is you need both parts. You need first there to be taste given over from the kosher, non-kosher meat into the kosher meat. And then, because even though you remove the non-kosher meat, the whole stew is usser because min b'mino eno batel. So that is the complicated first explanation. That was a bias explanation. Rava said, I have a simpler explanation. I can explain it. Says Rava, turn the page to daf Kuf Amud Bet. Afilu tema lo kadam v'silko. I can say it's even where you didn't remove the non-kosher piece before you put in the whole stew. Because the issue here is that even though min b'mino eno batel, right? The fact is that, again, you have three components here. You have the first piece of non-kosher meat, you have whatever pieces of kosher meat that touched it, and you have the whole stew, the potatoes and the water and all, and the gravy and all the other stuff. The reality is that although min b'mino eno batel, in a scenario where you have min mino and anomino, right? You have three components, meat, and non-meat. What you would normally do is you would pretend that the mino is not there. And you would basically say, we have 2 ounces of treif meat in this. We have 200 ounces of anomino gravy. That would be mivatel the mino, right? Sorry, mivatel the meat, which is mino, right? And therefore, the fact that the rest of the meat is min b'mino would be negligible if it didn't give taste over to that meat. So says Rava, I'll read inside. Afilo tema lo kadam misilko could even be where you didn't remove the non-kosher meat, but have you min umino, min is the it type and type, meaning meat and meat, which one is kosher and one is not, vid davar acher, and a third party or a third component, which is not meat, right? It's the stew, and we call it the potatoes. And whenever you have min umino v'davar acher, what you do in that scenario is you're salaket mino kamisha eno. You look at the kosher min as if it's not there for a moment, and you look at whether the eno mino can overtake, let's say it's 60 to 1, the non-kosher meat, right? She'ein mino rabba alav mivatlo, and it would cancel it. And therefore, in a scenario where you didn't first have the non-kosher meat touching the kosher meat and giving over its taste, if you just had the non-kosher meat and then the whole container of kosher meat and gravy and potatoes thrown in there, in fact, it would be batel like Rabba Bar Chana. And all Rav was saying was you got to be really careful about the order that you added things, because you don't just look at the final product, you look at how it got there. And so it's quite complex. And again, there's many. That's Rashi's pshat I told you. Tosas is a different pshat, or Ephraim, I think. But very, very practical questions about this. And in fact, I'm gonna skip some of them, but because later we're going to get to much more interesting, not interesting, but much more relevant questions that happen to us all the time of basar b'chalav are very similar, right? Because the scenario is much more realistic if you talk about a drop of milk into this pot of meat, right? Which happens all the time. So, or could happen all the time, right? Where you take a very negligible amount of milk and you drop it on a piece of meat, and then you drop that meat into a whole pot that has 500 pieces of meat, right? Which is a very similar case, right? And we'll get to that case actually, or similar cases in next parak of basar b'chalav.
So these are all when you accidentally have the piece of non-kosher meat in.
Correct,
If you
100%.
deliberately put it in, you're out of luck.
Correct. Yeah, 100%. Just to be very clear. Even though the order here is that, it's not that you purposely then took all the gravy and said, oh, we got treif in there. Let's pour 500 pounds of gravy in and get rid of it. Correct.
Yeah.
That would not be permitted. Okay,
Yeah.
says the next Mishnah, back to Gid Nasha for a little bit before we finish the parak. Noheg b'tahora ve'eno noheg b'tme'ah. The prohibition of eating a Gid Nasha applies to an animal that's kosher and does not apply to an animal that's not kosher. So if you capture a lion and you eat the Gid HaNasheh, you're not chai for eating Gid HaNasheh. Okay,
Chayav for eating non-kosher meat. That's in the today's Torah reading.
you are chayiv, you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, okay, we're going to debate
Although
that.
although it's a different prohibition.
Well, we're going to debate that, but you're not chayiv for Giran Nashat. Rabbi
Right.
Yehuda says, no, I disagree. Af b'tzmeya, you're also chayiv even in a non-kosher animal. This applies to all animals. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, I have a very simple proof to you because the Torah talks Giran Nashat when it's talking b'nei Yaakov, right? It says right after Yaakov was injured in the Parsha, right? Al kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael Giran Nashat, right? Alo b'nei Yaakov nesar Giran Nashat, and of course b'nei Yaakov had no other mitzvot. They didn't have to not eat lions. They could eat any animal. They could eat a behemat tmeya. The whole prohibition of kosher and non-kosher animals only exists after Har Sinai. And therefore, if they couldn't eat the Gid Nasha and they could eat any animal, then they clearly can't eat the Gid Nasha of a non-kosher animal. Amrulo said the Tanakama to Rav Yehuda, that's a mistake. It says it in the Torah, but in fact, there was no problem with Gid Nasha for Bnei Yaakov. This Sinai Ne'amar, it was only said at Har Sinai, but it's written, it's like it's added in basically in the right place. So that when the Torah says it's referring to only Bnei Yisrael after Har Sinai, because there was no such thing as Gid Nasha prohibition before Har Sinai, and therefore you can't prove it from where you are. So that is the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, top Kuf Amud Bet, V'Sava Rabbi Yehuda Iser Chalal Iser. Right? Rabbi Yehuda is clearly of the understanding in our Mishnah that although a lion, I'm using the lion example because I don't know that many animals, a lion is not kosher. The Gid HaNasheh, and a lion is born, presumably not kosher, right? The Gid HaNasheh is a second Isser, it's called the Isser of Behemat Tme'ah, right? So Rabbi Yehuda clearly holds that Isser Chalal Isser. But that can't be because we have another mission of Atanya. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, there's a Braita that we actually had in Zvachim, where Rabbi Yehuda said the following. Remember that halacha, just to remind everyone, oaf, a bird, has a very unique halacha of tum'ah. So that a dead bird, nivelat of tahar, a bird that was not shechted, right, that died or was killed otherwise, that's eaten is mitameh bigadim abeit habli'ah, right? If you swallow that bird, the wearer, the person who swallows the bird becomes tameh, their clothing, they become tameh and their clothing become tameh. Okay, so that's the Torah. We learned it out. We learned a lot about this in Zvachim by kosher birds. The question is, does that apply to a non-kosher bird? Right. So let's say you have I don't want to pick a wrong bird because Charlie's gonna give me a hard time. A raven, let's say, right? Ravens are definitely not kosher. Right. So you have a dead raven and you swallow it. You of course are over a prohibition of eating a non-kosher bird. That's this week's parsha. But are you also over a prohibition of tumah? Do you become tameh? So says Rav Yehuda in the Braita, you would have thought, Yachal tehei nevelat of tameh. You might have thought that the body of a tameh bird, meaning a non-kosher bird, is mitameh begadim bebeit habli'ah, that it is like a kosher bird, and it's mitameh the eater, and his clothing, bebeit habli'ah, by him swallowing in his throat. Talmud Lomar, therefore, there's a pasuk that says, Nevela utrefa lo yochel, right? Lo yochel, litamaba. Don't eat a nevela or a trefa to become tameh. And what we learn from the pasuk is that misha isura mishum ba tochal nevela will make you tameh. Something that you can't eat because it's a nevela. For example, a chicken that dropped dead, right? So chicken usually you could eat, but because it's a nevela, you're not allowed to eat it. So then if you do eat it, you're mitameh begadim abeit habli'ah. But yatza zeh, it excludes the raven, she'ein isura mishum bal tochal nevela, el mishum bal tochal tme'ah. Right? The reason you can't eat the raven is not because it's a nevela. You couldn't eat it even if it was shechted, because it's tme'ah, and again, tme'ah here means a non-kosher bird. Right? So therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, there is no prohibition, not no prohibition, there's no halacha that tuma happens through a nevela of an of tameh. Ask the Gemara, sorry. Sorry, pause for a second. So what you see from there is that although there is an existing prohibition there's an existing prohibition of behema, of of tameh, Rabbi Yehuda does not hold that a new status of tuma falls onto that bird. So the same thing was true about Gid HaNasheh, right? That by Gid HaNasheh, since it's an animal, a lion that's not kosher, a new prohibition of Gid should not fall on the Gid from that animal. So that's the question. Says the Gemara, well, maybe I have an answer for you, because maybe maybe Rabbi Yehuda holds, this gets to our Mishnah, that in fact a gid is not usher. The gid of a lion is not a lion because there's no taste. Remember, we discussed last week, does a gid actually count as food? If you hold an ein begidim benotein tam, it's not food. So you could eat the gid of a lion because it's like, I don't know, I mean, it's not food stuff, it's like wood, right? And therefore, bitmei nami iser gid ika, iser tumaleka. Maybe by a lion, when Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says there's an Isser Gid, it's because he holds there's no Isser eating it. And so therefore, because you're in theory allowed to eat it, the Torah comes along and says, but don't eat the Gid HaNasheh, right? So maybe that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. It's not Isser Halal Isser. There's only one Isser. But says the Gemara, that can't be the case. The Savar Rabbi Yehuda Megidim Enotein Tam. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold that the Gid, this nerve of the animal doesn't give taste? But Tanya, but we learned, this was a bright that we had last week as well. Ha'ochel gid hanasheh shel behemat me'ah. If a person eats, sorry, we didn't have this last week yet. If a person eats the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, right, a lion, Rabbi Yehuda mechayev shtayim, Rabbi Shimon puter. We're going to get to Rabbi Shimon tomorrow. Why he says you're not chayev anything, right? Because clearly he holds gid hanasheh is not a problem with a non-kosher animal, and ein begidim benotein tam. But Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayev twice. Right? And obviously the fact that you're chayiv twice means you're chayiv for eating lion, eating behemat tme'ah, and you're chayiv for gid hanasheh. So he clearly can't say that the reason you're chayiv gid hanasheh is because you didn't eat the animal. You wouldn't be chayiv twice then. Answers the Gemara, you're right. The olam kasavar yesh begidim benotein tam. You're right. Obviously Rabbi Yehuda holds that a gid counts as meat, and if you eat the gid of a lion, it's like eating meat of a lion, and you're chayiv for behemat tme'ah. Why are you also chayiv for gid hanasheh if he holds ein isur chalal isur? Because Rav Yehuda holds kusavar noheg bishlil. He holds that the isur of gid hanasheh applies to a fetus. And then since it applies to a fetus, the second the animal was born, not even before they were born, the second the animal was formed as a fetus, it was a lion with a gid. And so the isur happened at the same time. The isur gid, the isur tuma, b'hadi adadi ka'ati. The status of gid hanasheh, the isur gid hanasheh, and the isur of non-kosher animal both happened at the moment of this animal's creation, and therefore they are chal together because it's not one isur falling on another isur, it's two isurim happening at the same time. So that is the way you have to understand Rabbi Yehuda, and he holds that gid hanasheh applies even to a fetus. Says Gemara, well, that's a really great answer, but you have to, in order to give that answer, you have to have forgotten daf yomi. Because matzit amrit, can you say that Rabbi Yehuda holds noheg b'shalil? Hatnan, the opening Mishnah of our parak, which we learned around 10 days ago, said the following words: noheg b'shalil, gid hanasheh applies to a shalil. Rabbi Yehuda omer eino noheg b'shalil, v'chaba mutar. Right? Rabbi Yehuda said in the first Mishnah that gid hanasheh does not apply to a shalil. So great answer, but it's not true. Right? So, because Rabbi Yehuda clearly says that gid hanasheh does not apply to a fetus. Remember that we had this halacha a couple of weeks ago that basically a fetus, a shlil, is considered to be part of the mother, and so the gid of the shlil is just a part of the fetus. It's not a distinct thing, right? You can eat it according to Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara, you're right. That is true by a kosher animal. Hani mili gabe tehora. By a cow. The fetus of a cow is considered to be a piece of the mother. And therefore the gid of the fetus is not considered to be its own gid hanasheh. It's considered to be the gid of not the gid of the mother, but a piece of the mother, right? Just a piece of meat, right? Until it's born. By Tahora, Rahmana Omer, remember we darshan from the pasuk, Kol ba behema tochelo. Anything in the animal, right? That was one of the sources that a shalil is mutar because it's inside the animal. But that's only true by a kosher animal. You can eat the fetus of a cow. You can't eat the fetus of a lion, right? Aval bitme'ah, but by a non-kosher animal where there's no heter to eat the shlil, because you can't eat the mother, so you can't eat the fetus, there you don't view the fetus as a distinct entity of the mother. You just, it's as a part of the mother. Rather, you view it as a distinct entity of itself, in which case the moment it's formed as a fetus, its gid becomes asur as well. And so, according to Rabbi Yehuda, in a non-kosher animal, the isur of the gid and the isur of behemat tme'ah would happen at the same time. Aval b'tme'ah noheg. So that is how you'd have to explain Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Says Gemara, still it doesn't add up. because it's very clear, we're going to see why in a second, that the animals are considered to be formed before their body parts are formed. Mi matzit amrit titravayo b'havi hadadikatu. Can you really say that the animal is considered to be an animal and therefore behemat me'ah at the same moment that the gid is considered to be a gid anasheh? Vatnan, there's a Mishnah, a completely unrelated Mishnah, which says the following. Remember that a Nazir is not allowed to become tamei to a dead body and includes an ohel. And the Mishnah says, and if it does, and if he does or he or she does, then they have to, bring a carbon and break the Nazirut and start over again, the whole achot. So the Mishnah says the following. We're 10 lines from the bottom. Al elu tumot hanazir migaleach. On the following exposures to tuma, a Nazir has to cancel the Nazirut and go and shave and start all over again. Al hamet, if they're in the ohel, in the same room as a dead body, ve'al kizayit min hamet. Or if they're in a room where there's a kizayit amount of flesh from a dead body. And so that's the Mishnah in Nazir. The Kashla, now we asked them that Mishnah, what do you mean? If you're saying a kizayit makes you have to cancel your Nazirut, obviously a whole body does, right? Al kizayit min hamet megaleach, if you have to shave and redo your Nazirut for one kizayit, al hamet kulolo kol shekain, obviously for a whole body you have to do it. What's the chiddush of that? Why does the Mishnah doesn't make any sense? The Amr Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan explained in Nazir, lo nitzrucha el lenefel. What's referring to is that even if a woman had a miscarriage, and that nefel is in the room, but it's such an early fetus, shalonit kashru evarav begidim. I'm trying to translate it in English, but it's avarim, its organs or its limbs did not yet get tied or connected with the gidim, which, remember, gid can mean many, many things, but here it means gidim probably the bundles, right? The soft connective tissue, sinews. Obviously, by gid Hashem means nerves, but the Gemara uses it for both. But it's basically the fetus has not yet formed distinct organs and does not yet have even a kizayit of basar, right? But still, it's tameh. So that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. The chiddush of the Mishnah is that obviously, if it's a piece of a dead body that's a kizayit, it's tameh. But even if you have such an early stage where there's not really, it's considered to be a fetus, so it's tameh, but it doesn't even have meat yet or gidim yet, so it's completely unformed. Therefore, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that still that, because it's a unit, will make the person cancel his nazirut and have to start over again. What's the relevance to us? What you see from us is that obviously you can consider something a fetus before it even has a gid, right? Alma iser tuma kadim. You see from here that the iser tuma in an animal, in a lion, for example, or a fetus, if it's a human that you're talking about tuma, literally tuma, comes before the body forms. In which case, you can't say that the gid hanashef formed at the exact same time as the baby lion. The baby lion is tameh is usher, sorry, right away. The gid doesn't come till later. So again, we're back to our original question. So why does Rabbi Yehuda, who holds ein isur chalal isur, and we know that because he says that the bird that's tameh is not mitameh, a bird that's tameh that you swallow does not make you tameh, your begadim tameh, because that's only true by a kosher bird, not by a non-kosher bird. So he clearly holds ein isur chalal isur. Why is the isur gid hanasheh a second isur on top of the isur of eating a behemat tmeah? And answers the Gemara now, 4 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the bottom, 6 lines from the bottom. Afal Gav, that there's a difference. Because even though Isser Tuma Kadim, you're right. Physically, the animal is considered to be an animal before it develops a Gid Anasheh. So the moment the fetus is an animal, it's considered to be Asr because it's a lion. But still, 5 days later, when the Gid forms, Ati Isur Gid Chayaleh, the Isser of the Gid will come and will be effective and add to that. Shekain isuro noheg b'bnei noach. Because look, the isser of gid is a much more broad isser, right? A non-kosher, not nevela, behema tmeya is kosher for a non-Jew, right? Non-Jew does not have to eat kosher meat, right? They can eat a lion. So that meat is usher for a Jew, but it's okay for a non-Jew. But the gid hanasheh is one of the Shavim mitzvot b'nei noach and will apply to b'nei noach. And therefore, when the Isser Gid comes, it is an Isser that's called an Isser Mosif, right? It adds more people. I mean, Rashi has different versions of this. Here, Rashi actually calls it an Isser Chamor, but later he calls it Isser Chamor the same as Isser Mosif. But it's a more a broad mitzvah or more broad avera because it applies to more people, including non-Jews. And so, since it affects the non-Jews, it also affects Jews who already couldn't eat the animal because it was a non-kosher animal. And so, in this kind of scenario, Rabbi Yehuda would hold that Isser is Chal Isser because it adds, it's an Isser of greater stringency. And Dekanami, if you actually read our Mishnah, you could have inferred that from Rabbi Yehuda. The Ketani, because Rabbi Yehuda said in our Mishnah, I'm Rabbi Yehuda, Halo mi b'nei Yaakov nesar gidan naseh. Look, gidan naseh was ushered to b'nei Yaakov, v'adayin behemat me'ah mutaret lehem. They were still allowed to eat a behemat me'ah. So I explained in the Mishnah that it was that time period. But says Zumar, what Rabbi Yehuda is really saying is that although b'nei Noach are allowed to eat behemat me'ah, because it was before because it was before Har Sinai, right? They're not Bnei Yisrael. They're not whatever, not Jews at that point. They're allowed to eat behemoth me'ah. Still, the Isser Gid is chal, and so because Isser Gid is a broader Isser, it will be chal on a behemoth me'ah, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda says that if a person eats the Gid on Nashev, a non-kosher animal, they're chayv twice. Once for eating the non-kosher animal, and once for eating the Gid of that non-kosher animal. Now, tomorrow, we're 2 lines in the bottom, we're going to go back and try to understand why Rabbi Shimon says you're not chayv anything for eating that gid anasheh. So you're gonna have to wait till tomorrow morning to get that answer. So
It's not obvious that B'nai Noach are not supposed to eat the Gid Hanasha because most in the time of Yaakov Avinu, most of the world was non-Jews. Um, are they
right,
going to give a source for this?
not here. Actually, we talked about it in Sanhedrin, I think, about gid
Yeah,
anasheh in the seven. We
and
don't talk about this much more here, to be honest.
yeah,
Uh,
it would seem that this discussion would also apply to gelatin, which does it's made from ground up animal parts, but not meat, and doesn't have any taste. And there are rabbis who permit gelatin.
if it's not the gid anasheh, I guess.
Yeah, it's not. Well, it actually could be a get hanasheh.
So that might be a different problem, right? So remember, if you hold aim gidim and tam, which I do think is how we paskin, the gid
Yeah,
anasheh, even though there's no tam, is usher. It's an exception.
right.
I think the heter you're talking about, the people who have gelatin, is that it's a bone or it's whatever, and it's not taste.
Yeah.
Anyways, I don't want to get into that details. But tomorrow morning, 7:45, hope all can join. We'll
All
continue
right.
exciting discussion.
Yasha Koach.
Shavua tov.
Shavuot Tov.
Butov.